There's a lot of work going on right now with both CDC and the American Public Health Association, as well as some others. So there have been a lot of presentations and publications recently from these two organizations, and be able to rely on their expertise. But again, the public health approach right now is that we know that changes in the climate are going to lead to more variable weather, such as heat waves, severe weather events, and that these impacts are going to vary across all of our populations. And also these events are going to, or most likely, will negatively impact the health of our communities. And also at the individual level, but we really can't predict what those are going to be, so it's kind of hard to prepare for. And so we're using some of the emergency preparedness approaches that we've been developing over the last decade and some of those plans to try to be prepared for health threats related to climate change as well. So in a couple of different publications, they'll list kind of the climate event and what we think the health effects are going to be, with the idea that we really don't know and these are best guesses. But for heat waves, and we know what happened in Chicago a decade or so ago with heat waves, you have heat stress, you have deaths related to heat stress, particularly among the elderly and the very young, and also people with respiratory disease. When you're talking about heat waves, people with COPD, with asthma, you tend to have high ozone days and it's hard for them to breathe. No extreme weather events, tornadoes, hurricanes. Obviously, health effects would include injuries, drowning, some contagious diseases that may be spread in the aftermath, such as what they're seeing in Haiti right now after the earthquake. Obviously, those most at risk are those, SES is socioeconomic status, so those who don't have as many resources, who can't leave, who can't move, and those living in high-risk areas, such as those prone to flooding, prone to hurricanes. We need to make sure they're prepared. Droughts and floods, one of the biggest concerns are vector, food, or waterborne diseases. And of course, those will affect multiple populations. Going with that, we have the ecosystem migration, which is food and water shortages. So as our climate changes, you can no longer grow grain where you've traditionally grown grain. Instead, you're doing that farther north, and what that's going to do as far as our food supply. Obviously, most at risk with that is low socioeconomic status. People with the means will be able to find the food, but those without will have a harder time. And of course, the elderly and also young children are most vulnerable when it comes to malnutrition. And then finally, increases in ground level pollutants and allergens. How many of you have allergies, have spring allergies? And how many of you are noticing this spring that you're feeling a lot more miserable a lot earlier than you usually are? We know that we've got flowers blooming 2 to 3 weeks ahead of schedule this year alone in Michigan. And so doctors are seeing more people coming in complaining of allergies. And this is a minor thing. So we know that people with respiratory conditions are going to be most affected, and especially for the elderly, again, young children, those are always among our vulnerable populations, and those with respiratory disease, especially people who, for example, my father-in-law has COPD, also suffers from allergies, is on oxygen. So he's kind of the triple threat right now, and as a population would be very concerned about given some of the potential changes. There are others. Obviously, food quality and safety are a huge public health concern. Again, as our ecosystems change, as our food supply changes, making sure that food is produced in a safe manner and that we have enough, so that we have food security, we're taken care of on the food security end. And with that, the water quality and safety, which also includes sewage and septic systems. In times of flooding, obviously our sewage systems are impacted, and we want to make sure that our water quality, our water remains safe. And that goes along, of course, with the waterborne diseases and concerns there. Air quality is a huge concern for lots of reasons. Wildfires are, of course, a concern as well, and that goes along with the drought and the changing in climate. The other three are ones that we talk about but aren't always as, I guess, more readily recognized. One is mental health, and as people are dealing with problems they haven't had to deal with before, especially in cases of severe changes, they're not prepared for it. People who are displaced because of events, there's going to be mental health concerns, and do we have the systems and the providers to care for them in those situations? And again, with that is provision of health services. We have lots of people with chronic diseases, lots of people who will be in need of healthcare services depending on the event, and do we have the providers in place and in place in the right geographical location? I actually work here at Michigan State University. I work in the College of Human Medicine, where we talk a lot about the provider shortage that we are facing in this state, particularly around primary care providers, both nurse practitioners and physicians. So from that perspective and from a health system perspective, do we have people in place to care for those who are going to need care depending on an event? And then, of course, housing and transportation. So if we have people who are displaced from tornadoes or from floods, do we have a place for them to live and to be safe and healthy, and do we have a way to get them there? So there's a lot of discussion, especially in some work on the CDC, about co-benefits or synergies between public health and climate change, and about how one action that will benefit one can also benefit the other. So, for example, on the climate change action, decrease vehicular travel, cutting down on emissions, reducing the use of fuel. Well, that's also going to help on the public health end, because we'll have fewer car accidents with fewer cars on the road, fewer trucks on the road. So you're going to have fewer accidents. You're also going to have decreased air pollution. So you're not going to have some of those concerns, or you're going to start to lessen some of those concerns. The same with increased fuel efficiency and decreased pollution. Increased use of locally grown food. You're not going to have the same use of pesticides with more locally grown, obviously, especially with organic foods. You're not going to have the same fuel use, so you've got the air pollution. And some potential for increased nutrition. As we're seeing more and more people start to use locally grown foods, fewer processed foods, it has the potential for some improved nutrition among some of our populations. And then changing in zoning codes to curtail urban sprawl, talk about complete streets. I know there's been talk about trying to build schools closer into town, try to make it to where you can actually bike or walk to school. Not only the air pollution, but also increased physical activity, which is a huge focus for public health and childhood obesity issues. So changes that positively impact climate change can have a positive effect on public health, and vice versa. Things that we do in public health to improve situations can also improve some of our climate change issues. Oops. And then some additional shared concepts. So there's a lot of talk around environmental and climate justice. And we also talk a lot in the public health community about health disparities. And shared in that is that there are populations that disproportionately bear the burden of what's going on in our world, whether it's an environmental issue or a public health issue. We have populations in this state that are disproportionately worse off on health outcomes. So how can we work together to specifically address issues that affect populations both under that environmental justice issue and our health disparities work? And also the complexity of systems. One of the challenges for public health, and when you're trying to evaluate the success of a public health initiative, is that there are lots of factors that can impact on these programs. There are lots of factors that impact the outcome, and the same is true in anything you're trying to do around climate change. So how can we best map these systems to better understand how we're interacting and what the outcomes are? So the CDC a couple of years ago put out their policy on climate change and public health. And their National Center for Environmental Health has really been leading the efforts. We actually, 2.5 years ago, I think at the public health conference that we have every fall, had the gentleman who at the time was the director for the National Center on Environmental Health come and kick off our conference. And we focused on a lot of these issues where he stood up and kind of gave a really stark speech about what we're looking for if we don't get better prepared for what could be coming our way, especially around water issues. But CDC wants to be a credible source for information on what the consequences are for our health, both for the U.S. and globally. Make sure they're tracking data. They want to expand their capacity for modeling and forecasting what the outcomes will be. They want to enhance the science base, which is really something we're trying to work out right now. There's not a lot compared to some other issues. Identify, again, locations and groups at the greatest risk. They want to do a better job with communication, which is a huge concern and a huge issue, both for public health and obviously for climate change professionals, and something I know, and Lori's going to talk about some work going on here in Michigan, that was a constant theme in some meetings about the need to better communicate some of these risks. What to obviously develop partnerships, which are always a key to success, and provide leadership at all levels and with all partners. And then their final three, they want to develop and implement preparedness plans, similar to what they've been doing with bioterrorism threats and other emergencies, provide technical assistance to partners and state and local governments, and develop the workforce to make sure that our next generation is prepared for these challenges. So I wanted to give you two great resources. And the first, obviously, is the National Center for Environmental Health. They include there some funding opportunities, which are out there right now. They've come up and published a list of research needs around climate change and public health, so it gives a good idea of where the shortages are and what we need to know, and who their partners are, and also articles that have been published on these issues. And then the American Public Health Association is right now pretty close to ending up an almost year-long series they've been doing of webinars on public health and climate change. And the current status of efforts, some challenges that are facing us. There was a presenter a couple months ago about kind of a spectrum of beliefs about climate change, and where people are from completely accepting it to completely denying it, and how you can shape communication messages to everybody along that spectrum, and how to wrap that in then to public health issues. So these are, I can come and give an overview, and I'm happy to answer some questions. I just wanted to give an introduction so that our other presenters could share. They're doing a lot more work than I am. But these are two great websites about what's going on. Are there any questions right now? If not, I will turn it over to Lori. Yes, ma'am.
Let me just say thank you already, because this is the great untalked about issue. Normally energy issues and energy conferences are attended by the people who produce energy or are concerned about energy policy, and they're technicians, and they don't look at this issue.
You know, and there's lots of people in this room that I know that are working, especially around energy issues and health. Obviously, I'm sure you're all aware that there have been different proposals for coal plants and concerns about the health with those. And, you know, our state has one of the highest rates of asthma in the country, especially childhood asthma, and there are some in the areas that we're talking about building these coal plants. So it's a topic that needs to be discussed, and I think there are a lot of people who care about it. But again, the challenge, and I'm sure Lori will talk about this a little bit too in some conversations, but you know, we don't talk the same language all the time. We talk about the same ideas, and we all kind of want to go in the same way, but we don't use the same language. And so part of the challenge is how do we communicate in a way that we understand what everybody's talking about.